Welcome, dear brave soul. You're tuning into Horror Podcast, and I'm truly grateful you're here. Whether you're a long-time listener or just stumbled upon this channel, thank you for joining me for another scary tale. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and means more than you know. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, what brought you here, or even what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Your support keeps this channel going, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Now, let's get into today's horror story. There are some stories you carry for years before you let them out. My father worked with the U.S. Forest Service most of his life, and after he retired, he told me things I'd never heard before. Things he said he couldn't bring himself to share while he was still on the job. The kind of experiences that sat in the back of his mind every time he walked into the woods alone. My name's Daniel, and the one story that's haunted him most took place in the summer of 2004, deep along the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. He and another ranger, a man named Mark, were sent to track down a bull elk that locals called Chester. The animal had become something of a fixture in the area, often grazing near the tree line by farms and cabins. He was docile, predictable, and almost a mascot for the folks who lived nearby. When Chester went missing for over a week, it raised concerns, not just from locals, but from biologists who tracked the herd. The plan was simple. My dad was dropped off along a middle stretch of the trail to cover ground on foot, while Mark drove the service truck about 5 miles farther down to loop back from another access point. The two of them would meet somewhere in between by evening. It was hot that day, the kind of heat that makes the forest smell sharp and resinous, pine needles baking under the sun. My dad walked for over an hour, scanning the edges of meadows and listening for movement. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard it, the sharp snap of branches somewhere off to his left. At first he thought it was a deer. Then he remembered why he was there. He veered off the trail, stepping through brush until he caught the smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the sour, heavy stench of something dead. The clearing he stepped into was small, ringed with saplings. At the center lay Chester. Even before he saw the tag on the ear, my dad knew it was him, and the sight stopped him cold. The elk was sprawled on his side, mutilated in a way that didn't add up. The eyes and tongue were gone, the throat torn open. His belly had been ripped apart, intestines spilling across the ground like a rope pile. Flesh had been chewed from the torso in ragged chunks, and the front right leg was missing altogether. Predation was the obvious thought. Black bears roamed here, coyotes too, but elk aren't easy prey, even for them. My dad told himself maybe a desperate pack of coyotes had managed to bring him down, or that a bear had found him weak or injured. But something didn't feel right. Predators kill, eat, and move on. What he saw looked more like a body dismantled. Uneasy, he radioed Mark, told him he'd found the elk, gave his coordinates. Mark said it would take about an hour to circle back with the truck. That meant my dad had to wait. Alone, he stood in that clearing as the sun sank lower, the light breaking into fractured beams through the branches. He had a flashlight and a canister of bear spray on his belt, but the vulnerability set in fast. Every sound sharpened. The forest, which had always been a place of work and comfort, now felt watchful. 15 minutes later, the noises began again. Heavy steps in the brush, the crack of branches breaking, a low sound, half growl, half exhale, floating from somewhere just beyond the clearing. He froze, raised the flashlight, shouted into the trees. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed, pacing, breathing, snapping twigs like something circling. Coyotes don't stalk like that. Bears usually crash straight through, make themselves known. This felt deliberate. My dad shouted again, sweeping the beam of light across the undergrowth. The noises shifted but never retreated. They only grew more agitated when he raised his voice. For nearly an hour, he stood there, nerves on fire, listening to whatever was moved just out of reach. When the glow of headlights finally cut through the trees from the trail, he felt a rush of relief so strong it made him dizzy. Mark appeared, following the beam of his flashlight. The noises in the brush quickened, retreating into the distance with the sound of crunching leaves fading into nothing. My dad recounted what happened in a low voice. Mark's expression hardened. "Probably a bear," he said, though without conviction. "Let's get this done fast." They wrapped the elk in a heavy tarp, muscles straining as they dragged the bulk toward the truck. It was messy, exhausting work, and all the while, the sense of being watched lingered. When they were nearly ready to leave, my dad hesitated. Something gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, he walked toward the spot where he'd heard the pacing earlier. Mark followed, flashlights sweeping the ground. What they found shifted everything. Behind a fallen log lay Chester's missing leg, half-chewed. Scattered nearby were candy wrappers, a strip of nylon rope, and a pair of nitrile gloves stained dark with blood. A few feet farther, shoe prints pressed into the dirt. Human, not animal. Beyond that, the remnants of a small fire, the ashes still clinging to the shape of charred sticks. Beside it, a torn comic book. The realization hit them both in silence. This wasn't an animal kill. Someone had done this. Someone had been crouched in those trees, watching my dad as he stood alone in the clearing, making those guttural sounds, pacing like a predator. The thought made his stomach twist. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch him, choosing not to, content instead to stalk him in the dark. Mark muttered, "We need to go. Now." They hauled the tarp into the truck, slammed the tailgate shut, and drove out without another word. Later, when he finally told me this story, my dad admitted they made a pact then and they're not to report the details. Not the wrappers, not the gloves, not the prints. They told the Record it looked like a predator kill and left it at that. Both of them knew the truth would raise more questions than answers, and neither wanted to be the one forced to keep explaining it. But the memory stayed. Every time he hiked a stretch of the Appalachian after that, he felt it again. The sense of something just beyond the tree line, waiting. He never shook the thought that whoever mutilated that elk hadn't just stumbled through the forest. They had camped there, prepared, chosen that place. We moved to Virginia a year later. My dad never walked that section of the trail again. When I asked if he would, he shook his head. "No," he said flatly. "Once was enough." The way he tells it, the worst part wasn't the elk. It wasn't even the stalking. It was the silence that followed. The knowledge that someone had been out there, close enough to kill, and decided instead to let him walk away. And that, he said, was something the forest could never make peace with. My dad was a journalist for most of his life, the kind who still believed in notebooks and pens long after everyone else had switched to laptops. When he retired, he shifted into writing books, but his old habits stuck with him. The way he paid attention to details, the way he listened more than he spoke. Sometimes, when I ask him about stories from his reporting years, he'll smile and brush me off. But every now and then, he'll lean back in his chair, look a little far away, and share something that never really left him. One of those stories came from his time on the Appalachian Trail. He hiked long stretches of it whenever he could, using vacation days or taking unpaid time just to get away from the noise of deadlines and city life. He loved the rhythm of it, walking through endless green, watching the seasons shift leaf by leaf, and finding himself in the company of strangers who were, for a short time, friends. He told me he preferred hiking alone, but he never turned down company when it showed up naturally. The trail has a way of throwing people together. You'd arrive at a shelter around the same time, share a meal, and sometimes stick together for a few days. My dad said those moments always felt genuine, free from the posturing that happens in the real world. Out there with sore feet and damp socks, no one pretended to be anything they weren't. That's how he met Jeff and Molly. They were a couple from Indiana, both in their late 20s, hiking the trail as a kind of test before deciding where their lives were headed next. Jeff was lanky and sunburned, with a beard that looked half intentional, half grown out of laziness. Molly was smaller, with quick eyes that seemed to catch everything. My dad said they had this lightness about them, the kind of energy that made miles feel shorter. He'd been hiking alone for nearly a week when he crossed paths with them near a creek, and by the end of that first evening, he was glad for their company. They camped together for 3 nights. My dad told me that some of his best memories on the trail came from those kinds of evenings, sitting by a small fire, trading stories while their boots steamed in the smoke. Jeff played cards. Molly read aloud from a dog-eared paperback, and my dad shared some of the instant coffee he always carried. It wasn't deep friendship, not in the way we think of in the long term, but it was something honest. They trusted each other with the silence of the woods, which is its own kind of bond. On the 4th morning, they split. My dad was pushing for a town stop, real food, a shower, maybe a soft bed for one night. Jeff and Molly were taking their time, pacing themselves. The goodbye wasn't dramatic. They hugged briefly, promised they might cross paths again down the line, and went their separate ways. 2 days later, my dad walked into a small town along the trail. He described it as the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked from the highway. 1 diner, 1 post office, a handful of houses clinging to the road. He stopped at the diner first, eager for eggs and coffee that didn't taste like tin. He sat at the counter, his pack propped against the stool, listening to the hum of voices behind him. That's when he caught the words. At first, it was just fragments from the booth nearby, couple killed out on the trail. My dad froze, fork halfway to his mouth, straining to catch the rest. He turned, asked them what they were talking about. The locals looked at him, wary, then said a young man and woman had been found dead at a campsite just off the trail. No names, no details, just the fact of it. Later that day, when he tracked down the sheriff's report, the pieces fell into place. It was Jeff and Molly. The story that came out was brutal in its simplicity. They had been asleep in their tent when a stranger approached. Jeff was shot, killed before he could even rise. Molly was assaulted, then stabbed repeatedly. There was no warning, no reason, nothing to explain why. Just violence in the dark, cutting off 2 lives that only days earlier had been filled with laughter around a campfire. My dad told me that learning about it hollowed him out. He'd just spent days walking beside them, sharing meals and miles. To imagine their lives ending like that, it didn't feel real. He kept replaying their last goodbye in his head, trying to freeze that moment as if it could somehow undo what came after. For weeks, the case consumed the trail community. Hikers whispered about it at shelters, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward the tree line. There were rumors about a drifter spotted near a trailhead, about strange footprints found by the campsite. Some people said it was a local with a grudge. Others believed it was someone who had blended in among the hikers. The truth was worse. A man with no real ties, who simply carried his violence into the woods and chose them at random. My dad wrote about it for his paper, trying to balance the need for clarity with the weight of the grief he felt. He refused to lean into sensational details. He said the point wasn't the gore, but the randomness, the reminder of how fragile the boundary between safety and danger really is when you're out there with nothing but a thin layer of nylon between you and the world. Even years later, when he told me the story, he admitted he still felt guilt. Not because he could have changed anything, he knew he couldn't, but because he happened to be ahead, because timing had spared him and not them. Survivor's guilt, he called it, though he wasn't technically a survivor of the attack, just someone who lived close enough to it that the shadow never left him. He said the hardest part wasn't writing the article or even attending the memorial the trail community organized. It was the way their laughter lingered in his memory. The sound of Molly teasing Jeff about burning the rice. The way Jeff strummed a broken chord on his guitar and insisted it was intentional. Those small, Ordinary moments have become haunting reminders of everything that was stolen from them. When my dad finally set the story aside, years later, he told me something that stuck with me. He said, "The woods will fool you into thinking they're only about peace and beauty. But out there, people are still the most dangerous thing you can meet. Don't ever forget that." It's a lesson I carry now whenever I hike, even on the safest seeming trails. The trees are beautiful, the silence restorative, but I never forget what he told me. That somewhere out there, a fire once burned bright with laughter, and only 2 nights later, that same fire turned into a crime scene. And that the line between those two realities is thinner than anyone wants to admit. They say the Appalachian Trail can change the course of your life, but not always in the ways you expect. For most people, it's about miles walked, friendships formed, or some long-earned clarity when the noise of the world finally fades into wind and birdsong. For some, it's the laughter of strangers who become friends, the relief of hot food after a stretch of cold meals, or the satisfaction of a map lined with pen marks and dirt smudges. But for a few, the ones who stumble into the wrong stretch of woods at the wrong time, the change is darker, irreversible. That's what happened to 3 young people in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina in the spring of 1981. My name's Aaron, and I only know this story because one of the 3 survived. She never spoke much about it for decades, not even to her family. The trail swallowed it the way it swallows everything. Quietly, almost politely, until it became one of those old rumors hikers trade in hushed tones around a fire. It's only now, years later, that the story has resurfaced, and with it, all the unease that comes from realizing how easily strangers can collide in a place where there are no walls, no doors, and nothing to keep the danger out. The 3 weren't experienced backpackers. That's important to understand from the start. They didn't have months of preparation or finely tuned gear. They weren't through hikers, the type who measure their lives in trail markers and resupply stops. They were, at most, amateurs, drawn by the idea of the trail, the romance of it, more than the reality. The first was a 19-year-old named Kevin Ellis. He had dropped out of community college that winter, restless in the way that kids sometimes get when the town they grew up in feels too small. Hiking wasn't really his passion. He wasn't the kind of person who read gear catalogs or spent weekends training with packs. But he'd read an article about the Appalachian Trail in a magazine and decided it was as good an escape as any. His parents thought it was reckless. Kevin thought it was freedom. In his mind, freedom was worth a little recklessness. The second was a girl named Rachel Boyd. She was 17, still technically in high school, though she wasn't enrolled that semester. The trail was supposed to be her version of finding herself, though it's hard to know how much of that was her idea and how much came from the older kids she looked up to. She had a way of saying yes to things quickly, without weighing what might follow. She met Kevin at a gas station near Asheville a week before. He had been filling his pack with candy bars and trail mix, things an experienced hiker would laugh at. She asked him where he was headed, and when he said north, her eyes lit up. Within hours, she'd said she wanted to come along. The third was the outlier, a drifter named James Red Hanley. He was 23. Though he looked older, his face weathered from nights spent outdoors and days spent moving from place to place. He had no real gear, just a patched backpack and a pistol tucked into the waistband of his jeans. His boots were cracked, his hair long and uneven, his manner unreadable. He was the type of man you might pass at a Greyhound station and never think about again. Except if you did notice him, you might remember the way he never quite smiled. The 3 crossed paths by accident at a lean-to shelter about a day's walk north of the Georgia border. Kevin and Rachel had been hiking together for 3 days, their rhythm uneven, their packs too heavy, their food running low. They were learning in real time how unromantic the trail could be. The Appalachian in spring was unpredictable, days that felt like early summer, Nights that dropped so cold you woke up shivering inside your bag. Their boots were damp, their socks never truly dry. By the third day, both were looking forward to stopping at the next wooden lean-to marked on Kevin's guidebook. A roof, even a rough one, would feel like an upgrade. When they arrived, Red was already there, sitting on the edge of the platform with his boots off. His face was lit faintly by the low sun bleeding through the trees. He looked them over without much expression, then nodded once. "Plenty of space," he said. The dynamic was strange from the beginning. Rachel was curious, her nature pulling her to fill silence. She asked Red where he came from, where he was going, what brought him out here. Red gave vague answers, here and there, north, maybe, but she kept pressing, her voice chipper, almost nervous. Eventually Kevin told her to let it go. My guess is they were both unsettled, but neither wanted to admit it. Out on the trail, there's an unspoken rule. You accept the company you get. The shelters are open to anyone, and refusing to share space feels almost impossible. That night, they shared a fire. Kevin and Rachel split a pack of ramen, boiling it in a dented pot. Red had only a small loaf of bread, which he tore in pieces and ate slowly, staring into the flames. The conversation drifted in and out, punctuated by long silences that felt heavier than the darkness pressing in around them. Every so often, an owl called, or branches cracked in the distance, but otherwise the woods were oppressively still. When it grew late, Kevin and Rachel retreated into their tent, the thin nylon a barrier that felt both comforting and useless. Red stretched out in his sleeping bag a few feet away, his figure silhouetted against the fire's dying glow. What happened in the early hours of the morning is still debated. Rachel, the only surviving witness, said she woke to the sound of movement, boots scraping against stone, the faint metallic click of something being handled. At first she thought Kevin was rummaging for something, but when she sat up, she saw the shadow of Red standing near the tent. His outline was clear in the half-light, stiff, unnatural. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Kevin. She remembered the flash more than the sound. A single shot. Kevin slumped instantly, the back of his head pressed against the nylon wall of the tent. He didn't even have time to cry out. Rachel said she froze, her body refusing to respond. Red turned toward her, gun in hand. For a long moment, she thought he would shoot her too. His expression was flat, almost bored, but he didn't. He just stared at her, then crouched and rifled through Kevin's pack. He took a knife, some food, and a rain jacket. Then, without a word, he walked off into the trees, leaving her alone with Kevin's body. Rachel stumbled out of the shelter at dawn, barefoot, disoriented, and half-mad with fear. The trail blurred under her feet, her thoughts reduced to one word: away. She ran until her legs burned, then walked, then ran again. Hours later, she found a road, where a driver stopped and picked her up. He said she looked like she'd been through a storm. She couldn't form words, just pointed back toward the mountains. At the ranger station, she finally broke, the words tumbling out uneven, shattered. A tent, a gunshot, a man with red hair, a friend who wouldn't wake up. The search that followed was frantic but fruitless. The trail is vast, and a man moving fast can slip through dozens of miles before anyone can track him. For weeks, hikers were warned. Some skipped shelters entirely, choosing to push long days just to avoid sleeping near strangers. The sense of community, usually so strong on the Appalachian, fractured under the weight of suspicion. Red was arrested 2 months later in Tennessee, caught shoplifting at a convenience store. He never explained why he shot Kevin. Some said it was for the pack, but others pointed out he hadn't taken much. Some believed it was a moment of paranoia, others that it was simply cruelty. Whatever the reason, the court sentenced him to life. Rachel never returned to the trail. She tried to go back to school, but her life was marked by what happened in that shelter. She carried the memory like a shadow, one she never escaped. Kevin's family buried him in their hometown, his grave a reminder of how quickly one impulsive decision, heading into the mountains with a stranger, can end everything. And Red? He vanished into the prison system, one of thousands of men serving life sentences. His name barely remembered outside of those who lived the story. What lingers most, at least for me, isn't the violence itself, but the randomness. The way three people, strangers in every sense, converged for one night in the wilderness. The way one chose violence, one lost his life, and one was left to carry the burden. That's the trail for you. It feels like the safest place in the world until, suddenly, it doesn't. And when danger comes, there are no walls to stop it, no locks to turn. Just thin nylon, dark woods, and the quiet knowledge that out there, the most unpredictable part of nature is still people.